done a series on this recently on my Saturday Extra program, and about particularly California and the green economy in California. And it's very, very interesting, and I've heard it before, is that this young man who used to work here as an environmental activist has actually gone over to America. But he says big, hairy targets in the US seem to have an incredible power to mobilise people's emotions and ambitions. Here in Australia, I mean, as we know, we're living through big, hairy targets sort of tend to frighten us, and the whiff of utopianism worries us a lot. It doesn't seem to do that in the US. It unlocks possibilities. It unlocks venture capital. Maybe it doesn't unlock average people's dreams, as we've just heard, but I've always felt it is a definite difference in cultural attitudes between here and there. It's
interesting you frame it in culture, and the minute you said venture capital, I thought of another way of framing it is it could be it's not so much the culture of Americans as big risk takers and going after hairy targets and things like that, as so much as that the rules allow you to do that. The rules on capital, on venture capital, are much more fluid, and so you can grab these opportunities and do them. That was an interesting point. You're talking, what's the role of government? And it's interesting, how would we measure it? The one way to think about it, what percentage of the money, what percentage of GNP flows through? That could be confusing, because that in a way reflects how transfer payments work. If you have a privatized pension system, it looks like you're not spending very much, not flowing through the government, but if the rules require companies to have pension systems, the government, there's a lot, this might be wind up the same amount of money. When you look at how much money do people have left in their pocketbook after they've had to pay the private education costs and the private healthcare costs in our system, well, it's not very much different than when I have French relatives. What they have left over isn't, their taxes are much higher, but they don't have to spend it on healthcare and private education. So those aren't so different. I wouldn't measure the growth of government by the percentage of money of GNP flowing through. I think the interesting debate has to do with the rules and regulations and what's going to happen. And those aren't necessarily, again, I don't think Obama and this new group of people are very preoccupied with making a bigger government. It's not the old day. It's not the old socialist model of government. I think it's quite different. I don't think they're terribly fond of using government as an instrument. I think that they don't want to run the auto industry or any of these other things. They just as soon pull back from it as quickly as they can, but they are going to be looking at regulation, and I think it's important. I hope that you're all talking about this book, Nudge, by Thayer and Sunstein. Sunstein was a Chicago law professor, and Thayer teaches at Chicago, and Sunstein's now gone to Harvard, but he's been appointed to a job in the Obama administration as, I don't know what it is exactly, chief regulator. And the idea is that you can give, from a freedom point of view, you can give people equal choices, but the results are different. My favorite example is you go to work and there's a pension plan, and one idea is you're automatically in the pension plan unless you opt out. And the other is you're automatically out unless you opt in. Now, from a choice point of view, these are equal. You have a choice in both cases. This is not Big Brother telling you you have to have a pension plan. But the research, the behavior research, shows that the effect is quite different. If people are automatically in, unless they opt out, the savings are much higher because people go along with that. And so that a lot of think, why is that? Actually, positing that way probably gives a cue to you that something you should do if people follow it. But so the book is all about these things taken out of behavioral economics, about ways in which you can structure things that produce quite important social effects, but which still give people a line of freedom. Well, that fascinates Obama and all the team around him. They love that kind of thing. And so I think that they want to do things like that, which are, to some, could be less government. One of the fascinating things in the Bush, Bush brought in this very, very big plan for your prescription medications because retired people were furious at what it cost them. Well, one of the things in the plan they brought through is they forbade the insurance companies from creating competition amongst the pharmaceutical companies to negotiate prices down. Now, that's very shocking from a pro-market point of view. I thought that was quite a shocking thing, that you were preventing an opportunity to bring prices down. Well, that's a regulatory move. I mean, again, I want to repeat, I think this idea of big government and small government, let's think of it politically. Are they saying that we want to use the government to help our friends and take the government away from their friends, or the other way around? I see a lot of the rhetoric of big government we're helping our friends and hurting the other people, and that pharmacy plan was a spectacular example to me of that. There are many, many other examples. So the debate is, how are we going to change the rules? Who are we going to help? I think they're interested in bringing in market processes. The discussion about, for example, finance is to let's actually enforce antitrust policy. Antitrust policy is using the state to make sure that we have market competition. So we're going to be careful about having banks that are so big that they can't fail. That's not a pro-market attitude. So,
okay, I was going to come back to it. I've got a gentleman standing there, so I'll come back to Bruce in a moment. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Michael Crumlin from the Melbourne Law School. I'd like the panel to comment on the American system of government and whether it presents problems for making major changes in public policy, whether it's subject to inertia or capacity for negative action, blocking the sort of changes that Obama may wish to promote. I remember 30 years ago there was a great deal of discussion in the United States after major volatility in world oil prices about the need for an American energy policy. And a man who was then an economist subsequently became a senator from Alaska, I've forgotten his second name. But he made a prediction which shocked me at the time, that America would never have an energy policy because the system would prevent it. And looking back from more than 30 years from that comment, it seems to me that he was correct. Tussig was his name. That 30 years after that tremendous anxiety over the impact of sharp increases of world oil prices on the whole American economy, there hasn't been any satisfactory response to that, and part of the problems that America now faces flow from that inability to deal with a huge challenge, a challenge of that dimension. Is this a fair assessment of the American system of government, and will Obama be able to change that?
Bruce, I was going to ask Bruce to comment first.
I'd like to pass that one to Michael. Thanks. Yep.
Well, I love that old proverb that Americans do politics very well and government very badly. And I myself think that there's elements of genius and elements of farce to the American system as it plays out in the 21st century world, where you've got the legislature that's entirely separate from the executive, where you have no effective party organisation within the legislature, where you can have an appointments system that means a year after Obama is sworn in, it's likely that very many of the senior positions in his administration will not be filled. It's a crazy way to run a country. It's a crazy way to run a superpower. And it's only the dynamism, I think, of the American economy, the optimism of the American people that carries them through. I think if a country our size tried to set up our affairs like this, we'd be finished. And I think it goes to the issue of climate change that the previous questioner asked about. I don't think that the public inertia is going to be the problem. I think the problem is going to be persuading Congress to come up with a bill that has real teeth, because it's not like the Australian system where the government can simply say, well, look, balancing all these different interests and these different geographical and regional and functional interests, this is what we have to do, this is in the national interest, everybody put their hand up. It may not be a wonderful exercise in democracy, but I think it gets you closer and more quickly to effective action than what we're seeing at the moment, the awful sight of all these Democrats in these resource-rich districts pushing back against almost any effective action. Now, I don't want to be negative about it. Something very positive may come out of it. But if it does, it will require Obama to step down from the lectern and to start to exert leverage and pressure in Congress and start to spend his political capital. And we've talked a lot today about all the positives about Obama, and I admire him as much as anybody on the panel, but I also see a certain vanity in the way Obama conducts himself. He loves the applause that he gives for his admittedly very fine and beautiful speeches. We have seen so far a willingness to compromise quite early on a number of issues, both domestically, like the assault weapons ban, and internationally as well. We've seen a little bit of steel more recently in the last couple of weeks, but until that, we hadn't seen too much evidence of steel, and that's what I would like to see on climate change and on healthcare. Not so much always letting the congressional chieftains, you guys go off and formulate what you've got. I'd like to see him step in, start to use his enormous popularity and prestige to start driving through some changes.
So whether he's the immovable rock is yet to be seen. Bruce?
I don't think I want to add to that except to mention that California was spoken about earlier, and unfortunately California is becoming a failed state. It has passed a budget recently with an enormous deficit. It went to its electorate asking for further agreement on borrowing, and that was rejected. And California probably, I've lived there for many years and I love it, but it will probably not be able to resolve its budgetary difficulties until it has some kind of change in its governmental system, which is not easy to arrange. So on the general question of US responsiveness to pressure from government to change behaviour, I do believe that one very big difference in the American culture from ours is this much greater emphasis on personal freedom and also government at the local level. Many more decisions about government are made at the local level, as we know. And I think Americans cherish that, and they cherish the ability to carry an assault rifle if they need to. And so I think it is going to be harder to impose on people a government-mandated scheme to change incandescent bulbs, and that's going to be a problem. And it's not the kind of big picture vision that putting a man on the moon was. Now, maybe energy independence could be such a vision for the US, but it has to be framed in a way that is really emotionally appealing.
Waleed Ali has written a very good essay on this in the latest edition of The Monthly, the Australian writer, Muslim writer, and he just obviously was quite struck by, in his view, the way personal freedom was the unifier when he actually went to see how much it was the capacity, personal freedom and the capacity to be an American was actually with the glue. And I thought he identified it, in the way he put it. I thought he put it extremely well. Don Watson's written about that before too.
Hi. My name is Bill Leventrosser. I'm a professor emeritus of political science at Hofstra University in New York, and now associated with the University of the Third Age here in Sydney. It's been suggested, I think, that change is more likely to be incremental rather than a major kind in American politics. And it's not likely we're going to be looking to any Russians for suggestions. However, in yesterday's Sydney Morning Herald, a very famous Russian, Mikhail Gorbachev, has suggested it's time for an American perestroika. I wonder what the members of the panel think of that suggestion.
I also noticed he sort of suggested that Pope John Paul II had introduced the Holy Spirit to him. I think that was in the same interview, actually, that Gorbachev gave, so it was quite an interesting interview. Michael?
Well, what I certainly would say is this, that I mentioned at the beginning the themes of pragmatism and liberalism. A third theme I didn't mention, but is absolutely evident in Obama's approach to the world, is ambition. He is enormously ambitious. He is remarkably confident in a sort of otherworldly way. From day one in the White House, he's been remarkably confident in his surroundings. If you look at the list of issues that he's taken on, from the emphasis of development over democracy, from the Middle East peace to climate change to trying to reset relations with Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba. It's an enormously full agenda, and he's enormously ambitious. And I think the other thing he has in his favour is so far an ability to execute things in a in an impressive way. And just one short anecdote, if I can, Geraldine, and I think I've told Lynn and Bob O'Neill and one or two other people this story. But I was I was in Washington during the inauguration, and I was standing in front of the Capitol. And a couple of hours before Obama got up to speak, I saw a bald eagle soaring and swooping above the U.S. Capitol. And I thought, this is wonderful. This is a heavenly portent. I mean, this is the moment when everything will change and the walls of Jericho will fall, and this is incredible. The mandate of heaven is being passed. And I mentioned this to the woman next to me, who was a rather more cynical soul, and she said, no, that eagle's a trained eagle. It's a ring-in by the Obama campaign. They're so efficient and effective that they've done that. And I thought, you know what, that would almost be as good. Because after 8 years of the Bush administration flubbing around and coming up with grandiose plans and then failing to deliver, if you have someone who can execute in government, even 50% as well as he did during his campaign, then he really can achieve his ambitions, and maybe you can see a bit of that American perestroika.
What do you think about that, Peter?
Well, I think the chattering classes like me and Michael, we love Obama because he talks well, he's articulate, he does things like this. I agree with you. If he produced that bald eagle, that was pretty clever, because the previous guy would shoot him down. Cheney would shoot the bald eagle.
He would shoot the guy next to him.
Or he'd shoot the guy next to him. He'd shoot you, So it's a great improvement, and we love it, but we are the chattering classes, and the chattering classes just are mesmerized by those speeches and things. And I don't know about the perestroika. I think it is a moment for perestroika. I think there is a desire to change. People have been unhappy with what's happened in the last bunch of years. The response to Katrina is, I think, quite properly a very big symbol of all that. So there is a lot of hope for change and a lot of desire for it, but I don't know that those speeches do it, what the speeches do in the smoke-filled rooms in making the bargains and the deals, I don't know.
And whether in an era of individuality it's quite as easy to bring in a perestroika based on the commons, which is really what we're talking about. Look, just two final questions, because I'm watching my time. Quick
thank you. Yes, it'd be quick. Robin Fitzsimons. Just a brief comment on the question before last in relation to specifics of education. And I guess it might depend on whether you're referring to schools or to universities, and in the case of universities, whether you also encompass research within that concept. But anyone who's been talking to, and in America talking to medical academics in the last month or two, will have been struck by the fact that they're all absolutely manic putting in stimulus grants for what is variably quoted as between $8 and $10 billion. And I'm not sure whether that's just for medical research or research in universities generally, but it is generally regarded as a hugely positive thing.
Interesting, thank you. Like they're putting in grants for ovals here and getting them too. Yes, please.
Okay, John Caladevera, undergraduate from University of New South Wales. I just wanted to ask the panel a general question of general comments on how they think Obama should tackle the issue of bank regulation. And in particular, bank regulation. Bank regulation. And just from my perspective, I particularly would like to hear how Obama will develop Basel III in light of the adequacy of Basel II, particularly with how Basel II failed to, determine risk appropriately, as well as prevent banks creatively developing financial structures that they can circumvent these Basel rules. And so I'd just like to ask the panel how would Obama tackle generally the issue of bank regulation?
Just a small one for our penultimate question. A very good question. Peter.
Well, I'd like to leave the details of that to the next panel, but Robert Lawrence, again, is the answer to that. But I'd like to make a kind of a general comment about that, first of all, which is that there's a lot of talk about regulation, and I am expecting regulation. I think there's going to be more rules separating banking out a little bit more. The idea that we can let everything consolidate, I think that hasn't worked very well. So we're going to sort out finance into different functions. There'll be a traditional banking, which will be vanilla type, and then we'll have other kinds of things that are free to do whatever they want, and we'll have more careful reserve requirements. That, to me, is one of the shocking things that happened in the last years, was the casualness with which financial institutions okay, it's great, we're going to have financial innovations, we're going to create these new bonds, but you have to allow them to use those bonds to satisfy their reserve requirements. That creates a degree of leverage of extraordinary fragility. So I think we're going to get a lot of reforms on that in the future, which I welcome. But the point I want to emphasize is I'm not so sure that regulation is the sufficient way of understanding what happened. It's not that we didn't have regulations. We weren't using the tools that we had. The Federal Reserve, the Securities and Exchange Commission, a lot of those institutions had instruments in their hands which they could have used. They could have had stricter reserve requirements. They chose not to use them. They could have inspected what was going on in mortgages. They weren't doing it. And I think it's to remember that it's one thing to have the formal authority, but it's another thing, who do you appoint into those jobs? What do you ask them to do? The head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Arthur Levitt, at one point wanted to bring forth a rule that would forbid accounting firms from also doing consulting to the firms they were auditing. And when he proposed it, which seems like a nice idea, that would be getting rid of a conflict of interest. When he proposed that, the accounting industry went to Congress and lobbied like crazy and said, you've got to prevent him from doing that. And he stopped doing that. So that's political process and political pressures stopping a regulator from using an authority that he had. So I'm in favor of a bunch of new rules, but without the politics to support those rules, without the capacity to sustain them, it's insufficient just to look at a formally changing the structures won't solve anything if we then elect people and put pressure on them not to enforce what we have.
Bruce.
Just make one point on that. The root cause of the crisis perhaps is in two things. One is the expansion of liquidity that happened over this long period, but secondly, the failure to assess the quality of loans properly. And so we had a number of mortgage loans that got into the system which were really unable to perform properly once there was any uncertainty in the economy. And those mortgages were sliced and diced and repackaged into collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, and were sold and resold in smaller and smaller pieces throughout the system. And the regulatory problem there, I think, was that there was no consistent way of describing those mortgages. Each mortgage broker, each mortgage facilitator had his or her own way of putting the data together. And so it was impossible for those that were acquiring the mortgages and then repackaging them to really understand what they had. Now, there are technological solutions to that which are under discussion. And I think that will help a great deal to give more certainty in the system that what you buy has a certain risk in which you can assess. That's an important component. Now, Basel requirements will, I think, also have an impact because there will be increasing reserve requirements, possibly other ratios that banks and institutions will have to take. But one of the most important things also is bringing into the scope of regulation bodies that were hitherto not regulated, such as the hedge funds and perhaps to some extent private equity. So I think there's a lot to be done on the regulatory side, and we're still going to be working through that for some time.
Michael?
No.
And of course, we won't go there because I want to ask one final question, but there was a preference to try to extend home ownership to a whole lot of new people, speaking of the politics. And the minorities, of course, tragically, have been grossly disproportionate.
That's a highly partisan interpretation that is made. Yes.
Oh.
I'm sorry, I'm not aiming you at being partisan.
No,
I'm saying
but
that
I
when
thought
you
that
read that, that's a very hot thing. When you see that, you immediately know the political identity of the person making it. That is the Republicans attacking Barney Frank and the Democrats for creating a thing that sent all these loans off to these poor people.
But they are disproportionately affected.
Yes, they are, but the core is exactly what my colleague said. That wasn't the driver.
Yeah, okay, right.
That certainly happened, but it is an extremely rapid political... Yeah. I mean, part of the problem is that we discuss these things if they're technical. I don't think they are technical. They're very political. And the different interpretations mobilize people, and that was the immediate, you saw this immediately in Congress. Yes. The Republicans immediately went up and said, this is Barney Frank and the Democrats who caused this by giving all these loans to these poor, they never could actually say colored people, but people of color living in the inner city, and that's what caused this whole thing, and was a way of getting attention to what my colleague said, which is that the Federal Reserve and Greenspan and all these people were allowing these CDOs to spread like crazy. relaxing reserve requirements and absolutely enforcing nothing at all. That's the real cause of it. And yes, the minorities were very impacted by this. They contributed, but I refinanced my loan during that kind of thing, and boy, it took me 5 minutes. They didn't ask me any questions. They didn't even want to see my tax. I mean, I'm credit-worthy, you see, what a respectable person I am. But they didn't ask me anything. Yeah, that's what was going on. It wasn't those poor people in the inner city doing it.
An awful dance. Final question to you all, quick question. What advice would you offer him if he asked you for it? Peter?
What advice would I feel nervous with him in the sense that my values are a little bit more liberal than his, but I trust his political judgment better than mine. So I tend to defer to him, but I worry that he has not smelled the populist anger and isn't responding to it, and I would like to see him do more. My caution upon that is that that's my politics, and I don't want to impose, as I say, I trust his political judgment over mine. So I defer to the text, the compromises, the bargains that he makes, because he's the one who has to make them. But I think there's more. I'm worried about that point I made earlier. There's a populist anger out there,
brewing,
and I'm afraid of who's going to capture it, and I don't know. You know, Larry Summers, Geithner, they're all very smart people, but a smell for populist sentiment is not something they have. And so I worry about that these extremely smart people around him aren't telling him that. So.
Bruce?
I would really urge him to focus on energy independence of the United States, because I think its dependence on the Middle East, which is a significant political problem. I would encourage him to, and I know this is not popular, I would encourage him to foster a better environment for the implementation of new nuclear energy plants. I would encourage him to set up an international reprocessing consortium, which would help to deal with some of the issues of terrorism and sequestration of plutonium. And I would also encourage him to open the Yucca Mountain storage facility.
Michael?
Geraldine, I think he's got an incredible opportunity. Before he was elected, 80% of Americans thought the country was on the wrong track. Now, for the first time since the capture of Saddam Hussein, a larger majority of Americans think the country's on the right track. But I think Obama can't coast on that. Machiavelli asks, is it better to be loved or feared? And the truth is, you have to be loved and feared. And my only worry with Obama is he really loves being loved, and I want to see him get his knuckles a little bloody and impose some leverage, be ambitious, but have 2 or 3 big things that he wants to achieve, and spend some political capital to achieve those, even if it takes a bit of the edge off his popularity.
The aforementioned George Friedman has a great line here. The test of a president is how effectively he bridges the gap between what he said he'd do and what he finds he must do, which is, I suppose, another way of what you're saying. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've been very privileged today. Will you please thank our speakers?